Hello and welcome to this video on getting started with Bootstrap 5. If you were here for the last videos in this series, then you've got a strong grasp of the Bootstrap grid and utility classes. In this video, we'll focus on Bootstrap components. We'll start with a general explanation of what I mean by a Bootstrap component, and relatedly the concepts of a base class and modifier classes. For that discussion, we'll focus on Bootstrap's card components. We'll then go into some more examples of the alert component and how it ties into Bootstrap JavaScript functionality, and then a more complicated JavaScript-enabled component, namely the collapse component. And for that last one, we'll actually start by building our own collapse component from scratch using vanilla JavaScript, and then we'll see how you can do the same thing with Bootstrap, but without touching JavaScript at all. I'll do a number of demonstrations along the way. All the code I'm going to write in this course will happen on screen, so if you want to follow along, you can. And all the demonstrations I create will be available in public code pens, and you can access those in the links below this video. Feel free to fiddle around with those all you like. You can use them, abuse them, break them, remake them, and basically use them for whatever learning purposes or other purposes come to mind. What is a component in Bootstrap? A component is an object that we create by adding predefined CSS classes to our HTML to style it in a certain way. Bootstrap components are generally built with a base class and modifier classes. The base class would hold styles that are common to most instances of the component type, and the modifier classes add additional styles or variations. An example we've already seen is the Bootstrap button component. That starts with a base class of .btn, and then you'll generally further style it with modifier classes such as .btn-primary. To get a better sense of how all this works, let's jump onto the internet and into CodePen. That's codepen.io. I'm signed into my account already, and if you sign in or get an account of your own, you can follow along exactly. And then again, all these CodePens will be available in the links below. So we're going to build our first components, which will be a card component and within it a button component. And I'm actually going to start by just typing up all the HTML that I want to use with empty class attributes, and then we'll add Bootstrap classes to those to see how that changes things and how we can build up our components with Bootstrap's classes. I'll start with a generic div, give it a class attribute, and I'm going to leave that empty for now. Under that, an image tag. I'll fill in the source in a minute, and again, empty class attribute. Then another generic div, which is going to be a wrapper for the body of our card. But for now, again, no class attribute there, or no class. Then we'll put in an h5, just call it title for now. Under that, a paragraph, and I'll put in some random filler text. Under that, a button, and that's it for the HTML. For a photo, I'm going to go to placebear.com, and if you just copy one of these two links, I'm going to go for the black and white link. Oops. Copy like so, and then place it inside the source of your image tag, and we'll see how that updates. Yes. And I want some slightly different dimensions for my photo, so I'm just going to change that right now. 400 by, let's go for 240. I love that picture. 241. 242. Yes. And last, I want to set a maximum width for what will eventually be my card. And so I'm just going to create a new class here and call it max width, setting maximum width to 15 rem. Put that on the overall wrapper div. And we're ready to go. This is the HTML for a basic card component. So we'll have a photo on top, a title, and then some text, and finally a button. Let's now bring Bootstrap into this. So go to getbootstrap.com. Again, now we're in the docs. In the introduction page, we see this link here to the CDN, which we covered in previous courses. Copy that. And as I've done previously, I'm just going to put this right into the HTML, despite that there are other ways to do this in CodePen. And now we will be able to start adding Bootstrap's classes to this to make a button component. To begin with, let's just put a background color on this card so that we can see what the parameters of it are. And this is what it looks like without any styling, without any Bootstrap. To start things off, and in fact, you know what, without going into the card, first I'm going to look at the button component because that's actually going to be the simplest one here. So down to the button, as I've said before, a button component starts with the base class of btn. Let that update, and now we see we've lost most of the visible aspects of the button, but it is there. That brings in the common styles common to all buttons, or all Bootstrap buttons, and now we can further style this by saying something like btn dark or btn primary or success or whatever. So this now is a complete Bootstrap component. Base class, modifier classes, and all of it is coming together to make that component. Jumping into the developer tools, let's see where, there it is. So these are all the styles that come in through .btn. So there's a lot going on there. And these are the styles that come in through the modifier class .btn dark. The card component is a little bit more complicated than that, but really not a lot. We start again with our base class, which is card, and we'll see how that changes things. Right there you can see now we've got what is recognizably a card, and I'm going to put some margin on this. Give that M5, and now it's a little bit easier to see. So what has come in with just the card class? Well, let's look at the developer tools again and get a better sense of this. So in the card class, there's the position, display, flex. We can see that one makes a big difference. Where is it now? There's a border. So one thing about the card is that you can change the border with border modifier classes without also having the border class, and a border radius. So that gives it these rounded borders. In this instance, the card class by itself isn't going to cut it, and I'm just going to show one thing in particular here. If you look at the top corner of this picture, it's hard to see here, but it's actually, the photo has a hard edge, a 90-degree edge, whereas the border has that rounded edge. So those two aren't working very well together. What we can do for that is add some modifier classes. So on this image tag, I'm going to put a class called card image top. Pardon me, card img top. And we can see now that just changed the image so that its radius, the border radius on the image, is matching the border radius on the border of the card. And this is what the additional classes that you can use to extend a Bootstrap card do. They complement the base class of the card and allow you to add extra features which will all be consistent and styled properly so that they all come together to form a nice card component. In this case, we've got some stuff going on here. This is the body of the card, and as we saw before, I created this currently empty div, or rather classless div, and for that I'm going to give it a class called card body, and we'll see what happens. There we go. So now we've got margins or padding, as the case may be, which give this card a much more consistent and pleasant aesthetic. On the title, let's see what happens on this title. I'm going to give that the class of card title. Yep. Yeah, nothing, so that's fine. I think what's going on here is that the class of card title is basically just providing the same styles that were already inherent in the H5. So H5 had, for example, yeah, this is what was canceled out. Margin bottom of 0.5 rem. And then that was replaced by card title, which also has a margin bottom of 0.5 rem. So in this instance, card title isn't really doing much for us, but in some cases you might want to use that card title style for your title. On the paragraph card, text will be our style, and this one's going to be also very subtle. And to show how this one's working, what it's doing, I'm going to comment out the button. And then let's go look at this in the dev tools. So card text right there is just changing, it looks like, the last child of this element, and that's the difference. And we'll see that again if I just remove card text entirely. The margin at the bottom will change a little bit there, and that doesn't show up when there's a button below it. There are tons of variations you can do with the card class. I'm definitely not going to go through them all. I mean, you can go for, say, border colors. Let's let that update. There it is. And you can use various different variables. Let's try border success. And I'm going to give it text success to match that. One I kind of like is to throw a shadow on it. And that's going to cover it for the card component and for my general description of Bootstrap components. So the point here is just that a Bootstrap component is composed of generally multiple classes, not necessarily, but the classes involved here are different than utility classes, where the utility class does one thing, has one job. The component class is more complicated. It's a composite of various different style rules which together create a complete object, a complete component. That's the theory. Now let's do some practice. I'm going to open up this folder. This is the folder we created previously using Visual Studio Code. Creates a new document based on our template. Just copy that, paste it right there, rename it, and this one's going to be components.html. I'll link our style sheet to it. That's styles.css. And update the title in the H1. Hit save, bring it up with live server, and see if this is all working. Yep. The first component we're going to make in our components.html file is an alert. First question, what is an alert? Well, let's see. I happen to know that this law firm called Norton Rose has an alert in its website, and let's pull that up. There it is. So it's just this thing typically at the top that says, note this. In this case, note that we use cookies. Question 2, where do we find out about alerts in Bootstrap? Go to the Bootstrap docs, under components and under alerts, here it is. So these are a very simple component, and you can find out as much as you can possibly want to know about them in the Bootstrap docs. But you don't need that because you have me. So first, alerts. Let's start with an H2 heading for alerts. And under that, now we'll make a div. And this div will have one class for starters, and that is alert. Note this is an alert, hit save, and we can see that does not look like much. Why? Because we are using the .alert base class with no modifier class. And this Bootstrap component, like a number of others, really requires a modifier class to make it look like anything. So, for example, you could throw on a modifier class that uses one of Bootstrap's color variables. So alert success will make the background color green and the text a complementary green color. Or if you want a blue color, or whatever your primary color happens to be, then alert primary will do it. And another nice thing about alerts is that they have a class for alert links that creates a complementary color. And that is .alertLink. Hit save, and we see this guy now looks pretty appropriate for its context. You can also put HTML inside your alerts. So let's see what that would look like now. I'll wrap this in a paragraph tag. Throw in a horizontal rule, and maybe an unordered list. So these are a handy way to incorporate messages to your user, and Bootstrap has it all planned out for you in a way that makes it look pretty nice by default. One drawback with this particular alert is there's no close button. There's nothing the user can do to make this thing disappear, but Bootstrap has you covered there as well. And this brings in another topic that we haven't covered yet, which is JavaScript-enabled components. Most interactive parts of a website require JavaScript to run. By interactive, I mean the user takes some action and something happens. So for example, the user clicks a close button and the thing they're trying to close disappears. And that's exactly what happens in the case of an alert. So to make this happen, you need JavaScript running in the background, which will be triggered when the user hits that close button. Most of Bootstrap's JavaScript-enabled components can be built using pure HTML, provided you have the right JavaScript plugins already linked into your HTML, as we do. So let's just take a look down here. We used that starter template, which includes the script tag, and that's this link to the JavaScript CDN, the bundle JavaScript CDN. You would add the appropriate class or classes to the class attribute, and you would also add typically a data attribute, which would trigger the function or hook the function into your HTML so that it runs when the user does something. Oftentimes, you'll also need an ID attribute on the thing that's going to be changed. In this case, we actually don't. We'll see that in the next example of a collapse component. In this case, the alert is actually quite a simple JavaScript-enabled component. Let's take a closer look at the Bootstrap documentation to see how this all comes together. So I'm on the alerts page, and I mentioned that because this is where you can go if you want to get more information about alerts. If you want to have a dismissible alert, what you would do is add a close button somewhere inside the alert, add the alert dismissible class to the alert div itself, as we see here, and add a data bs dismiss attribute, this data attribute, to the close button. And that's what triggers the JavaScript functionality when the user clicks the close button. To animate the alert, you also add the fade and show classes. So let's see how this would look in practice. Step 1, add the close button. Now it actually doesn't matter where you add the close button, so let's just start by throwing it in right here with a class of btn-close, and it doesn't need any content. For now, well, let's just save that and see what happens. So that's not really what we want. I'm just going to put this button in various spots, and we'll see if we can find a good spot for it. And by the way, this is a demonstration. You're going to find out soon that this is not leading anywhere good. Let's see, I'll throw it in there. So pretty random, weird places for a close button. This doesn't look right because we need the alert-dismissible class on the alert itself. And what that will do is permit this close button to be absolutely positioned relative to the alert div. So watch what happens when I save this. I'm just going to pull this out of the way. I save the HTML, and all those close buttons moved all one on top of each other in the top corner of the alert. Because of the absolute positioning part of the alert dismissible class along with the btn close class, this close button will just automatically go into this top left-hand, or pardon me, top right-hand corner of the alert. Now we don't want all these buttons here, so I'm going to delete all but one. But this by itself isn't going to cut it. That button is not hooked up to any JavaScript functionality, so now we have to bring in the JavaScript. And we'll do that by adding to the close button a data attribute, which is data-bs-dismiss alert. Save that. And now it goes away. So I'm going to refresh the page, it comes back, hit the close button, and it disappears. This is kind of abrupt. It might be nicer if we could have this animated so it kind of fades in and out. And to do that, we would add onto the alert class both fade and show classes. Hit save, and now when I click there, it fades out nice and gently. You need both those classes working together, so if I get rid of the fade class and hit save, it's that abrupt kind of transition. And if I get rid of the show class, it just won't show up in the first place. That's saved, I'm refreshing the page, and it's just not there. So yeah, you need both show and fade, then it shows up and fades away. I'm just going to add an aria label here of close. And I'm also going to wrap everything here inside of a container, which I didn't do previously. Good. In the next demonstration of components, I'm going to go through the collapse component, and we'll start by actually building our own from scratch with our own JavaScript, and then we'll see how we can do the same thing with Bootstrap without touching JavaScript. The idea here is to illustrate how JavaScript is working together with Bootstrap HTML to allow you to create those interactive elements without writing your own JavaScript. For starters, I'll type up the JavaScript, and I'm going to fast forward through this. So this script defines a function called expandMe, and it starts off by creating this variable, which is defined as the element with an ID expand text. Then the function goes if that element, whatever element has the ID expand text, has a style of none, so that's the CSS property display with a value of none, then give that element, represented by X, a display value of block. So if it's got a display of none, meaning it's invisible, give it a display of block, so it'll be visible as a block element. Otherwise, give that element a display of none. So basically, if the element starts off as invisible and the user clicks a button to run this function, the function will turn it into a block level element so that it's visible. If the element starts off as visible, as a block level element, and the user clicks the button, then the function will run and make it invisible. Now we need something to actually expand and collapse, and so I'm going to start with a paragraph, and I'm going to give it some random text, 50 words of text, using my lorem ipsum extension. On this div with the paragraph that expands and collapses, I'm going to give it an ID of expand text, which is the same as the ID I referred to down here in the function. And I'm going to give this an inline style, which is typically not best practice, but it's fine in this case. Inline style with a display property of none. So by default, this paragraph will not be visible. Next, I need a button. And inside the button, an onClick attribute, which will refer to the expandMe function. So when the user clicks the button, the expandMe function will run. I'll hit save, bring it up, and let's see. Yep, there it works. So it's invisible. It has a display property of none by default. I click the button and the JavaScript makes it visible. Click it again and the JavaScript makes it invisible. What does this have to do with Bootstrap? Well, what this shows is one very common way that you can bring JavaScript into your HTML. So once this JavaScript has been referred to in the HTML, all I have to do to create the expand collapse function is create something that's going to expand and collapse and give it the ID expand text in this case. And I have to have something that the user can click, which will run the function. So two things, I've got a trigger to run the function and an ID to tell the JavaScript what's going to expand and collapse. And we'll see that Bootstrap does basically the same thing. Now, it's not using the same kind of JavaScript and it doesn't look exactly the same, but the point being in the background that Bootstrap comes along with a ton of JavaScript, which is already written for you, so you don't have to do this part. All you have to do is this part, put in the IDs and put in Bootstrap's case, data attributes, or in any event, the correct attributes to bring in the JavaScript. So let's see how that would work. I'm going to just comment all of this out entirely. Hit save, we've lost it. And now we'll create the same expand collapse function, or a similar Bootstrap version of the expand collapse function, but using 100% Bootstrap and not touching JavaScript at all. I'll begin by making a button component, and this will have a class attribute of btn and btn outline dark. Next, I'll make a paragraph, and it's going to have a class attribute of collapse and an ID of, again, expand text. So the ID tells the JavaScript in the background what is supposed to expand and collapse. Now we have to get the JavaScript into this HTML. So we start with, again, a data attribute, data BS toggle collapse. This means that when the user clicks the button, it will run what is basically Bootstrap's collapse function behind the scenes. We have to tell that JavaScript function which item is going to expand and collapse, and for that we use a data BS target. So think of it as the target of the function, the thing that it will make expand and collapse. And for that we refer to the ID that we just created here with first a hashtag, then the ID expand text. For now I'll leave it there, hit save, open it up, there's our button, and when we click it, the function runs. So just like we saw before, when we click this button, it transforms that paragraph from being visible to being invisible. And it does so with a nice kind of a fade down animation. Now to finish the thought here, so to speak, I'm going to add some extra attributes to bring this into compliance with best practices. I'll give it an aria expanded false, so that tells a screen reader that this thing is by default not expanded, and aria controls of expand text, which is again that same ID, and it's just telling a screen reader what this button is controlling. And last, just to pretty things up a little bit, I'm going to put a top and bottom margin on the paragraph using py3, just to give it some space between it and the button. Good, so it's that easy. We can see that the way that Bootstrap hooks its own JavaScript from behind the scenes into your HTML, or the way you do that, is very similar to what we did with our own JavaScript. So we need an ID to confirm the thing that's being changed. We need a button that the user can then click on. That's what the locus of the interactivity, so to speak. And we need that button to be hooked up to a function that runs when it's clicked, and in this case also this data BS target to tell the function what ID to look for. If this feels complicated, don't worry. You don't have to remember all of this or any of this to use Bootstrap's components. The Bootstrap docs guide you through how to do all of this stuff, including what class attributes to use, what HTML attributes to use, and basically how to put together each of its components separately. And they're quite complete and quite accessible. And that sums it up for my discussion of components. This video obviously was not a complete survey of all the components available in Bootstrap, far from it. There are quite a few, and I encourage you to look through the Bootstrap documentation to learn about what the options are. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe, and generally follow my future videos on YouTube. And if you want to learn more about Bootstrap 5 and you don't want to do so through time-consuming, painful, frustrating, and very demoralizing trial and error, then you may be interested in my courses available on Udemy. In the next video, we'll build our project website, and that'll give us a good chance to put together some of the skills and concepts we've learned throughout this course in one project. See you there.